Hello, I'm Robert, and continuing this talk about how Mars is a great place to explore and a fascinating place, but if you were thinking of possibly living on Mars, then it's not really the best of places to live. And so I got as far as talking about these are the McMurdo valleys, and they look very habitable, but this is actually in Antarctica. It might look as if it was somewhere like Iceland or somewhere. It's a very dry, cold place in Antarctica. And this would correspond to the most habitable region of Mars, except that the atmosphere would also be very thin in Mars as well, so thin that it would be a vacuum to all intents and purposes. And surprisingly, in these extremely hostile conditions in Antarctica, you actually do get life. But it's very much like living on the edge. It's nothing like human beings or cows or trees or anything like that. But you get what they call cryptoendoliths that live underneath the rocks. And these life forms, they have lifetimes. They are amongst, they really live life in the slow lane. So they are amongst the longest lived microorganisms on our planet. A single cell will live for millennia. This makes studying them very difficult. It's a sort of cross between microbiology and archaeology. And then we have a look at, for instance, the way that these colonies, the rocks flake off, and then you get a fresh patch again. So you will have different stages of this process on the rocks, and you can then kind of look at them and try and figure out what happens over periods of thousands of years. So if there's any life like this on Mars, then it's going to be very difficult to study on Mars as well, and quite hard to detect any signs of it. And it'd be very slowly metabolizing, make almost no difference to the atmosphere, and very small communities. And we're talking here about this would be the most habitable area of Mars, as far as we know, would be perhaps something like this. So if there is life on Mars, and there might be, then it's going to be quite hard to find, quite probably. Right, so this is a photograph of Viking took of this is the surface quite close to the equator, and that white there, which looks like frost, but it is indeed frost. And you might be very surprised if you listen to my previous video, because as I said, that these equatorial regions, the soil there is extremely dry, at least meters deep below the surface, absolutely no ice. So where does this frost come from? And it turns out that the Mars atmosphere, although it is extremely dry in the daytime, you may well know how humidity increases without any change in the water vapor. If you just cool the atmosphere down with the same amount of water vapor, it has less carrying capacity, and so as a result you have higher humidity. And you have these very huge changes in temperature in the Mars atmosphere. And as a result, as you get in the evening and the early morning, then you get this frost forming, and this means that the atmosphere at these times you get 100% humidity in the atmosphere. And if you think of places on the Earth, and you said, can you think of a place on the Earth where you have close to 100% humidity, you would probably think of the tropical rainforest. And in those conditions, you get these plants that are able to take in the water vapor just from the humidity in the air. And they have these aerial roots that just go into the air and take in water vapor. So might there be something like that that could be able to take advantage of these conditions on Mars? And it turns out that there's another analogue on the Earth which isn't so well known by most people, and that is this humble little plant, and this is a lichen. And this lichen, it lives in, and there are many different species of lichen that are able to do this. And they live in very cold places like in the high Arctic or high up in the Alps, these sort of places, and in places where it's extremely cold and there's no possibility of any liquid water, and yet you have the same possibility of humidity in the atmosphere which they could make use of. And that is exactly what they do. And that is how they are able to grow. And then another great thing about these lichens is that in the conditions where they live, then typically the ultraviolet levels are pretty high as well. So they have the ability to protect themselves from ultraviolet radiation, because with the very thin atmosphere on Mars, the ultraviolet radiation is extreme, and most life would be sterilized within seconds on Mars. On the surface, they're exposed to the ultraviolet light there. But this lichen, it's able to protect itself from ultraviolet light, and it's got melanin, which is the same as we have in our skin. So when you're tanned, if you have naturally dark skin, then you're protected by this melanin. Well, the lichen, it has melanin, but it also has a couple of extra chemical tricks of its own. And one is usnic acid, as it's so called, and it's also pyretin. And these are chemicals that you wouldn't be expected to have heard of unless you've studied these lichens. With the use of these, it's very effective at protecting it from ultraviolet light. So the researchers in the German aerospace, they had the idea of getting these lichens and putting them into a Mars simulation chamber. So for some time we've been developing Mars simulation chambers to simulate the Mars surface in better and better. It's very hard to do, as you can imagine, with the extreme changes of day and night, of the exchanges of temperature, and also the very thin atmosphere, and the dryness, and yet having this 100% humidity at night. It's quite a difficult thing to simulate. And then you've got all the ultraviolet radiation and the sunlight with all this UV light in it. But these simulation chambers, they're getting more and more advanced, and so the DLR, they put this lichen into a Mars simulation chamber, and they simulated all the necessary conditions, and particularly they accurately simulated the UV component of the light on Mars. So they had very accurate simulation of Mars sunlight. And in these conditions, then this, and of course no water at all, just the moisture in the atmosphere, the humidity, just as on Mars, and cold, just as on Mars, and a very thin atmosphere. And in these conditions, this lichen, it didn't just survive. So there are various, especially some very hardy microorganisms that may be able to survive in those conditions, but it was able to continue to grow. It was continue to metabolize and continue to photosynthesize. So a very surprising piece of research, this is fairly recent, over the last few years, and it's ongoing. They're having to do a series of experiments, and they do it for a month and then for longer periods, and they're taking up to the ISS and all this sort of thing. So these ongoing experiments, but as far as we can tell so far, nothing has told against this conclusion that this lichen, as far as we can tell, would be able to survive on the surface of Mars, just as it is. It would be able to survive in this landscape where you've got the frost, and so you've got the high humidity. It's not able to withstand full sunlight quite so well. So on the rocks that are fully exposed to sunlight in the middle of the day, it mightn't do so well there. But when you've got a little bit of shadow, it's somewhat sloped away from your midday sun, then that's where this lichen, it should be able to manage just fine. And it's got sufficient protection to be protected from the UV, and it also can make use of the sunlight to photosynthesize, and it can metabolize. That really is a truly remarkable result. And then there are many other possible habitats on Mars, but it would take quite a long time to go through them all. Let's just mention that you have, for instance, the solid state greenhouse effect. And this is, we all know about the greenhouse effect nowadays. It's been made so popular, the greenhouse effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, the solid state greenhouse effect is when you have a layer of either dry ice or ordinary ice. And then you have rock or soil beneath it. And then in very cold places where you have a layer of ice, you quite often find that the rock and the soil beneath it will melt through the heat of the sun and through this greenhouse effect. That the ice just above the rock, you get this molten habitable layer. So this could happen in the polar regions of Mars. And another habitat that could happen on the surface is that if you have an impact into the polar regions of Mars, then this could lead to a lake forms briefly. Of course, it will freeze over very quickly. But then if you look at what happens to it, if it's large enough, it can persist beneath this insulating and dry state greenhouse effect layer of ice above it, then it can stay liquid for order of 1,000 years or longer. So this is a possible temporary habitat that may form from time to time in the polar regions in Mars. And another habitat that can form is that you have these various salts. Now, yes, I haven't got a slide for this, but because I don't really want to talk too much about life in this, but there's definite evidence. I can talk about this in future videos, but there's strong evidence that there are salts detected on the surface of Mars, and it seems quite possible that these may have, similar to the lichen, they could take in the moisture from the atmosphere and so form a habitat which would probably be just below the surface of the soil. And this is a possible habitat that it would occur over much of the surface of Mars in the higher latitudes. And you also see patterns on the surface that look quite a bit like there could be some form of life as well, because they grow seasonally and then they contract. But I don't know, maybe do I talk about that a bit? Do I have a slide for that later on? Just checking. No. So I don't think I'll talk too much about that. But there's just one thing I'll show you, and that is this. And these are the warm seasonal flows. So this is a phenomenon. There are quite a lot of seasonal changes on Mars. It's quite a dynamic planet when you look at it in detail. Now, much of the surface of Mars, it just looks like the moon, and it's the highlands where the atmosphere is very thin and you have lots of craters. But there are other parts that are very interesting. And so this is one of them. And as you can see, this is a 1 year cycle that it's going through. And you can see that these streaks form, and they come down. This is a slope that's going down this way in the direction of these streaks. And it looks very much as if there's some form of liquid that is flowing down this slope. Now, you may have heard of the gullies on Mars, and this is a different seasonal feature which is believed to be caused by dry ice. And there's another thing, there's the Martian geysers, and these are very active, and they're just like Earth geysers. It seems that from the evidence of the debris that they leave, that another seasonal change. That certain seasons you get these geysers, but that's another dry ice phenomenon. But this doesn't fit dry ice. It's very, very hard. It isn't really possible to fit dry ice to this phenomenon, and it is believed that it's some form of liquid. Although it's very hard to quite understand how it can work long term, because if you've got this liquid, presumably there'd be some kind of subsurface aquifer, maybe geothermally heated, or maybe it's just the salts in it keep it liquid. And then the liquid is, every season, it flows down the slope. But if it's continually flowing down every season, there must be some method of replenishing it. Otherwise, it would just all be gone over geological timescales like hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. And it's a little bit difficult to work out what that mechanism is that is able to replenish it, and replenish it sufficiently rapidly to explain these warm seasonal flows. But there have been lots of surprises on Mars, and as we discover this more, look at this more, it's very hard to imagine it as anything else except some kind of liquid. And the most obvious liquid is some kind of very salty water. So that's a possible habitat for life on Mars. And there are quite a few of these habitats that have been discovered, but I don't want to go into them in too much detail, except just to say that they're there, and we'll come back to them. But this is one of the reasons why you want to keep Mars pristine, so you can study this and see if there is life there, and see what form of life it is. And especially interesting if it has managed to take a different form from Earth life, so that there's a possibility of something that might be like DNA, but it's got different bases, or there could even be some completely different chemistry that we haven't even imagined what it might be like. That would be the very most interesting case, if that might exist on Mars. So anyway, back now to the reasons why it's maybe not such a nice place to live. And here I'm talking now about the dust storms. So back to our old photo that we've seen many times. And here on the right, you can see the global dust storm. And this is something that happens every year, every Martian year that is, so it's roughly every 2 years, every 2 of the Earth years. And when Mars is close to the Sun, it has a highly elliptical orbit compared with the Earth orbit, which is much more circular. So when it's close to the Sun, then this is the dust storm season. And you're much more likely to have dust storms. And sometimes these dust storms, they all merge together to create a single large global dust storm. And this can last for weeks. And we have photographs of these also from the surface. So this is opportunity. And you can see that over a period of about 30 days, it's Sol 1235 and starting Sol 1205, so it's about 30 days. Then it got darker and darker and darker until it reached this point where 99% of the Sun was cut out by the dust storm. And these dust storms, once they reach that dark phase, they can stay at that darkness for weeks. So this is one of the things, another reason why you could get stuck in a dust storm for weeks in the middle of summer and absolutely can't see anything in the middle of when Mars is closest to the Sun. And then this also leads to the Mars landscape. So you look at the landscape, and many of the pictures that you see, I think invariably, unless the news story, if you read a news story about Mars, then unless the news story is about this particular topic of the colour balance, then the picture you will see will be like this one at the bottom, and it's adjusted so that it looks like Earth sunlight. So this is one of the ways in which these pictures are a bit misleading. They're not deliberately misleading. It's not like the scientists are trying to mislead anyone by doing that. They know exactly what they're doing. They're doing that because they are geologists, and the geologists want to be able to identify the rocks. And it's extremely hard to identify rocks if you see them like that. So make them so that they look as if they're illuminated by the Earth's sunlight, and that way you can then much easier to make them out. You can also see that the features are much clearer to human eyes. It's much easier to see the forms, the shapes of the landscape here than it is here. So like that, like for instance that patch there, and you can see much more detail more easily there than you can there. However, this gives a misleading idea of what the Mars landscape would look like to human eyes. Especially if you see a blue sky, this is an absolute giveaway that it's done like this. But even the kind of butterscotch kind of sky that you see, it's much more kind of dull, darkish, more of a greyish colour really. This is what it looks like. it has got this reddish tinge to it, but it's not a, it's a rather dull colour. And the landscape is extremely dull. And you may know that in the northern regions, like where I live in Scotland, then many people find it quite difficult in winter. I suppose the people who end up here where I live, then there are people who manage to cope with that. But in some, but you get people who get really sad in winter, and it's called get depressed in winter in the northern climates. It's called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD for short. So this is something that it may very well be that if you were to attempt to live on the surface of Mars, you might get very depressed, because it's just this continuous it's much worse than it is here, because there's no interesting landscape to look at. There's just this dull sky and the dull landscape. And if you want to see the landscape, it's sort of nice bright landscape, then you really want enhanced vision. So you want to put goggles on and see it through enhanced using cameras to look at the landscape. And that's the way you need to look at the Mars landscape if you want to see an interesting landscape there. Now there's another problem with the dust on Mars, and that's that the dust, it's been shown that the dust on Mars, the dust on the Moon, then it's moderately hazardous for human health. It's not as bad as asbestos, but it's bad enough so you wouldn't want the lunar dust in your lunar habitat long term. And it's quite possible that Mars dust isn't nearly so well understood, obviously, as the lunar dust, but it's very fine dust and may very well be bad for your health. And so here we have, this is an attempt to deal with this issue, both for the Moon and for the Mars, if we ever did send human colonists to Mars, which I'm suggesting we don't, but here we go. This is, if you ever did, then this is the, it's called the soot port. And so you see, basically the astronaut is wearing a kind of airlock on his back, and he crawls, the spacesuit is permanently attached to this. And if this is the actual spaceship itself, then he or she crawls into the spacesuit through this hole in the back, and they wiggle their legs and arms into it. And then the other way around, if they're returning to the spaceship, they would back onto the spaceship, and this thing that you see behind him, then this comes apart, and one part goes onto the spaceship and the other part goes into the spacesuit. So when you want to travel out, that's what you do, and then when you come back, then the two go together, and then someone inside will remove the hatch, and then out you get. And this is quite effective at keeping the Mars dust out. But what it doesn't do is to keep the atmosphere of the habitat in. You actually have about a cubic foot of the atmosphere inside the habitat that's going to leak out onto the surface of Mars. Now, a human being, we carry an absolutely surprising amount of microorganisms. So on my skin, I have it's 10 trillion microorganisms in about 1,000 different species, many of which are not very well understood. And coexisting with my body generally, inside as well as on the outside and everywhere, then I have 100 trillion microorganisms, which I think is 10 times the amount of cells in my body, and in 10,000 different species. So I hope I've got all those figures right. So that's definitely 10,000 different species. And again, those species are not very well known at all. There's a whole project, the Human Microbiome Project, to try and characterize these species better and to understand them. And surprisingly, many of these microorganisms, it's quite possible that they might be well adapted to be able to cope with Mars conditions. And it's certainly not at all impossible, especially since they aren't very well known. And that's because, for instance, there was an experiment that was done to try and find the microorganism. They used many microorganisms from many different places on the Earth, and they just tried them out to try and find, as a preliminary thing, to try and find the ones that were most able to deal with very low atmospheric pressure, such as equivalent to Mars. So if it's not in a liquid, but it's actually sort of in the atmospheric pressure, actually in the atmosphere, and if it would be able to live in those conditions. And they found that there was one, I think it was the most promising microorganism, or certainly one of the most promising microorganisms they found, that was able to not just survive, but actually, it showed signs of actually doing stuff in the very thin atmosphere. This was isolated from the human tongue. So this was a microorganism that was found on someone's tongue. It just was in their database of all the things that they looked at. You might ask, why should a microorganism that lives on the human tongue, why should that have an enhanced capability to be able to live in very, very thin atmosphere? And the thing is that you just do get surprising things like that, because microorganisms, they pick up these capabilities in the past and they don't lose them, they tend to keep them. So although it's now living in the human tongue, then at some point, maybe in the past, it needed to live, maybe it was up in high up in the atmosphere or something, who knows. But for some reason or another, it developed this capability to be able to deal with these conditions. So if a human being arrives on Mars, and then as soon as you start walking about on the surface, then you've got your spacesuit, and it's not probably not widely known, but these kind of, like the elbows and the knees of the spacesuits, then if you've got one that's very flexible, like walking about on the surface of Mars, these leak air continuously. So you've got a leaky spacesuit, you're also leaking air every time you get out. And it seems extremely, how can you possibly keep microorganisms? And remember, the smallest microorganisms, the ultramicrobacteria, they are small as 0.2 microns. They're per micron, that's a millionth of, that's like 1,000th of a millimeter. And so you've got these, even the tiniest of holes, or tiniest of just going through fabric or something, and these spaces leaking air all the time. And so it's going to be, I think everyone, I've read various papers on this, and everyone just accepts that as soon as you've got spacesuits on Mars, you are going to get microorganisms getting out onto the surface. And also, even more so, if you had anything that went wrong, like the habitat crashes, and even if the humans survive, then you have the interior of the habitat, whatever you've got in there, your food and your plants and everything. So that's another possibility. And then if you have some kind of accident involving the human beings, and if someone dies on Mars, you're not going to keep them forever in the habitat. And also, it's very difficult to keep these systems totally enclosed. And will you never ever need to vent the air or deal with some waste that you can't cope with and 100% recycle inside? It's really very, very hard at present day ideas of technology to imagine that you could possibly colonize Mars, or even have a surface visit to the surface of Mars without microorganisms getting onto the surface. But if they get onto the surface of Mars, then there's also it was used to be thought that it gets sterilized within seconds by ultraviolet light. But it's now known that for many microorganisms, then there are microorganisms who can survive for hours, and it just needs to be in a shadow. The ultraviolet light is not so amazingly sterilizing as all that, because all it needs to be is in a shadow, and even when it's falling down, it could fall down in a shadow. And so maybe it even never sees the ultraviolet light at all. So it seems not too difficult that you could end up having viable microorganisms on the surface of Mars, and surely there would be numerous viable dormant microorganisms on the surface of Mars after human visit. And then some of these would surely get into the dust with such huge quantities, and they would get into the tiny cracks in the dust. And then during these dust storms, when it's so very dark, and then it's also protected from the ultraviolet light in little cracks, which to a microorganism, a tiny, tiny crack in the dust would give lots of protection from the ultraviolet light. The Mars dust is made of iron oxide, which is good at filtering out ultraviolet light. And this was, I think, that Carl Sagan, he was already concerned about this long, long ago. And he was concerned that microorganisms embedded in a grain of dust, they could spread anywhere over the surface of Mars. And we know there are caves on the surface, so it could get blown below the surface of Mars, and it could end up tens of meters below the surface, where it's now protected not just from ultraviolet light, but also from cosmic radiation, which means even over periods of millions of years, it could still be there. Some microorganisms are able to stay dormant and then revive after millions of years. So one way or another, these are going to get spread out over the surface of Mars, and probably originally just the immediate vicinity of wherever the humans land, but gradually more and more and in the dust storms. And it seems really that it would be impossible to reverse that, it seems to my mind. It used to be somewhat optimistic when we thought ultraviolet light was much more sterilizing than it is now, and you had the ideas that you could just throw the dust up into the air from around the human habitat and that might be enough to sterilize it. But I don't think, it's rather hard to imagine that now, imagine that really working. At any rate, before anyone thinks of sending a human mission to Mars, to the surface, unless you have come to the decision that it is okay to contaminate Mars irreversibly, then I think you need very thorough studies to show that you're not going to do that, especially with these possibilities of habitable environments on Mars. I think you need to be absolutely 100% sure that you're not going to do that. Now, I've lost sight of my clock, so I'm not quite sure how this YouTube video is. But so this is one of the... I'm now going to go on and talk about alternatives for colonizing. So that's just a little look ahead. So sorry, on a different page. I'm just looking ahead to see what I'm going to be talking about next. So yes, I'm talking about other possibilities for colonization. So we don't want to say an absolute no, don't colonize outside of Earth. But it does seem that Mars is far from ideal. So where is the best place to colonize? And then we do want to explore Mars. And so how can we explore Mars, given that human beings are by far the best way to explore places? If you can have boots on Mars, then it seems in many ways that's the best way to explore Mars. But then you've got the paradox that putting boots on Mars is going to, might very well irreversibly contaminate it. Indeed, even if it doesn't contaminate it, then many of our instruments, they can detect just a single amino acid or a single strand of DNA. And how can you possibly avoid contaminating the entire area around your habitat in such a way that it's totally impossible to study it and see if there ever was any signs of even ancient life there? It's really very hard to see humans on the surface being able to do these very delicate experiments that require no life anywhere near the apparatus. And so how can we, but human beings are obviously a great asset, and we want them to be able to explore Mars. So we've got a bit of a bind that we want the humans to explore Mars, we want boots on the surface, but then it seems, how can we possibly do that without irreversibly colonizing Mars with Earth life and without contaminating it? So that's what I'm going to start talking about next, where we can get through that conundrum, and also the other ways of doing colonization.